Yeah, I can turn that on. Welcome to ProBox TV, our after show special. That's right. It was Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. versus Jake Paul. Pardon any mistakes. It's 1:15 in the morning here on the East Coast. That's right. Jimmy Smith joined by the champs, Chris Algieri, Paulie Malignaggi, to discuss what we saw a very entertaining card. But man, that main event, I mean, if you chased around a punching bag for 8 rounds and started hitting you for 6 minutes, I guess that would describe what we saw. When you look at the kind of Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. we were going to get, the optimistic idea was maybe he could get some throwback in there and throw some decent punches. Yeah, he kind of did that for 2 rounds, but man, gave up the first 8. That's not mathematically how you win a fight. Chris, what do you think of the entire main event?
Well, first of all, Paulie, I told you. I told you this guy was not going to come and try and win this fight. And he did not. He did not try to win this fight. He went out there, and I don't even know what he was doing there for the first 8 rounds. 9 and 10, he actually started to throw some punches. Actually had some success. I would have liked to have seen him actually try to throw some punches earlier to see how Jake Paul could have dealt with that. But listen, this guy is... I know that the idea is that Jake Paul's fighting real fighters now. Well, Julio Cesar Chavez has not been a real fighter for I don't know how many years. That guy who showed up tonight was not a real fighter. He was not there to win. He's got a win over him now. That's great, but Chavez did nothing for anyway. Stop giving this guy chances. Stop giving this guy shots. Stop giving this guy paydays. It's crazy that we keep giving Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. chances to go out there and fight the way, or not fight the way that he does. But listen, Jake Paul did what he had to do, got the win, beat up a faded champion who was 40 pounds lighter than him, but whatever.
Paulie, to Chris's point, the crowd very much behind Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., right? They wanted him to win. Every time he threw anything, they went absolutely crazy. So the people that book him can say, hey, it's not our fault. He continues to be popular. It just seems as though the crowd's still very much behind him. The popularity was still there.
Jimmy, you make a good point. This is why the UK fans are the best fans in the world, because they would never let an idiot like this continue to torture us with his presence in the boxing world. They would stop supporting a guy like this. You gotta be a special kind of on off the spectrum to keep supporting a guy like this over and over and over again. I'll tell you what, his father gets blamed now too, because his father also keeps on enabling this and cheerleading it and lying to the media and telling us he's ready and telling us he's having the best camp of his life and so on and so forth. So I don't care what you think about his father off of his legendary career or whatnot. Listen, even his father started his career fighting about 40 cab drivers too. So we're gonna keep it real on everything now, okay? So he's there's a bit of con artist in the whole scenario of the family there, okay? They're selling us, they sold us an entire con artist gig here, and everybody got involved in it. The whole family got involved in it, not just Julio. Matter of fact, Julio probably sold it the least. He didn't even do anything. I mean, you look at when Claudia was interviewing him before the fight in the locker room, he looked like he didn't want to be there then. So it's not like I think he sold it to us the least out of all. He's just the guy who they keep picking because he's easy work, and he's got a fan base that's dumb enough to keep supporting it and keep buying into it. And then, the entire family kind of enables it as well. The words of the father, because he's got such a legendary career, are really powerful in terms of promoting and making fans be believers and whatnot. So I think that also comes into play here. But ultimately, when it came to the result, we ended up getting the same kind of guy we were hoping not to get. Matter of fact, they even got me to buy into it. That's why the champ Chris is saying, "Hey, I told you." They even got me to buy into it, and I think this guy sucks. And I've been saying this guy sucks, and yet you had me buying into it. Let me tell you how much I think this guy sucks. A year ago, when he fought Uriah Hall, I hit up Mike Leonardi, who works with MVP Promotions, and I said, "Bro, whatever you do, do not make this guy with Jake. Do not make this guy with Jake. Don't torture us with this fight. Let me fight Chavez Jr. first on a card. And if he can beat me," this is me when I was out of shape, by the way. This wasn't me like now when I'm training. This is me. I was completely out of shape and just texted him after. I said, whatever you do, do not make this guy and Jake. Let me at least fight this guy. So let him at least prove that, if he can beat me, I'll give him the weight. I don't care about the weight. I'll give him the weight. And he won't even beat me. Do not make this guy and Jake, whatever you do. Do not do it. What do we get? They let a little bit of time go by because they were going to originally make it right away. They let a little bit of time go by so that the bad taste from the Uriah Hall performance, kind of disappears, and hopefully people forgot about it. Because usually to promote a fight, you usually put guys on the same card to build it up. Instead, it built it down. So what they had to do, they had to learn their lesson and say, okay, now we got to just keep him inactive, and maybe nobody will remember the Uriah Hall performance, and then we can just go straight into the fight. We can't even risk to build this fight because this guy's going to look so bad. And what do? They still make the fight. They still made the fight anyway. So I don't even want to hear, honestly, bro, I don't even want to hear Jake saying, like, I just beat your boy's ass. He's never been stopped, which is a lie, by the way. He's been stopped twice. He's the ex-world champion. This guy is an absolute disgrace, dude.
World champion, 40 pounds, 40 pounds lighter.
And his father enabled it too. His father's also disgraceful in this scenario too, bro. Because his father was enabling this the whole training camp too, to the point where he even got me to buy into it. Can you imagine me, who's the most skeptical of all? Who's the most pessimistic?
That was a great mistake there, Paul.
Glass half empty. Because of his father, they got me to buy into it because of the father. So even the father is absolutely disgraceful in selling us this crap, and getting and enabling this crap and pushing it forward.
Well, the thing is that, Chris, you can talk all you want about, the improvements of Jake Paul when you have a guy standing in front of you, not throwing any punches. His footwork looked absolutely awful. He looked timid, didn't want to be there. Hand placement was really weird. This idea that even judging how much Jake Paul has improved since his last fight against Mike Tyson, where he didn't look very good, it can be hard to judge when a guy's standing in front of you, not throwing punches. It's frustrating on both ends. Chris, is that fair?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Like, I'm not knocking Jake Paul's performance because he did what he did with the guy that was in front of him. And listen, Chavez has been a guy who's shown to be able to take a good punch, but also he just wasn't fighting back. It was your turn, my turn all night long.
And it was mostly Jake's turn.
And it was mostly Jake's turn because Chavez he got into position and just didn't throw. But I normally, I think a lot of people who've just seen Chavez for the first time fight this fight might go like, oh, this fight's fixed. He wasn't even trying to win. But if you watch Chavez's last 5 fights, that's exactly the way he fights.
Yeah.
He gets into position and then he just doesn't throw. I don't know what the block is. He actually did against Sergio Martinez. He couldn't get off until the 12th round. And then he fought in the 12th round and had a great round. Kind of similar to how we fought tonight. He didn't fight for 8 rounds. Round 9, he decides, I'm going to throw some punches. Wins the round. Then goes out round 10. I'll throw less punches than round 9, but I'll still throw some punches. Probably wins the round. And the judges actually gave it to him. So
that's why people think it's rigged. I've never bought into the whole Jake Paul thing is rigged. I've had a lot of people, a lot of fans and friends.
He hedges his
they rig this fight, and I tell him no, he doesn't rig the fights. What he does is he hedges the fights. He leverages himself in ways where they're smaller, they're not boxers a lot of times, and so on and so forth, so that he has advantages. And then you got to try to overcome the advantages. I get it. It's sort of like Joaquin Phoenix, when in the movie Gladiator, when they make sure they stabbed Russell Crowe first before he came out in the last fight, the last Gladiator fight. But in that case, Russell Crowe actually won. You got to basically overcome the.
So did someone cut Chavez's Achilles before he stepped into the ring? Because the guy didn't.
No. That's what I'm saying. All up until this point, that's what you see. Mike Tyson is 60 and he's got one leg. I get it, and honestly, it's par for the course because. The guy is not a boxer, so you got to make it entertaining, and you got in order to sort of keep money. It's sort of like the bull matador and the bull. They got to kind of domesticate. They got to inject the bull with sort of a tranquilizer. If the bull is 100%, he's going to kill the matador. So again, it's one of those situations each and every time. But this time, that was what I was telling people. That's what I've been telling people. No, Jake's not rigging his fights. No, it's just he's hedging the fight. Tonight was the first time I started questioning that. Because Chavez wasn't throwing punches, and then he threw punches. At the end, at the very end, he threw punches, like you said, Champ. And it's like, now it's not like you got a master boxer in front of you where you can't. You don't have Sergio Martinez in front of you. Sergio Martinez is going to offset your footwork. He's moved awkwardly. Now it's Jake who's okay. I give him this. He moved a little bit better. His jab was a little bit sharper. But when you don't have nothing coming back, it's a little bit easier to commit better to your jab. It's commit better to your shots. He wasn't jumping back 40 feet, but he was jumping back every time Chavez did throw a punch every once in a while. So it's still your turn, my turn. Jake is also a your turn, my turn fighter. It's not just Chavez being a your turn, my turn fighter. Your turn, my turn fighters never win world championships. There will never be a your turn, my turn fighter that wins a world championship. Some of them they challenge for world titles. I always tell people the best your turn my turn fighter I ever saw was Matthew Hatton. And he got to challenge for a world title, but he didn't win it. Other than your turn my turn fighters, even the very best ones, it's just not world class. You have to be able to punch in between guys. You have to be able to counter. You have to be able to hold your ground at times when the opponent is punching at you, so that you can punch at him. If you notice, every time Chavez threw a punch, Jake is flying. He's not flying 40 feet like when Tyson, but he's still jumping all over the place and getting out of range. And then he wants to restart and reset.
I'm having a hard time remember Chavez throwing punches, so I'm just it's hard for me to remember sequences that punches were thrown.
Pretty short.
But the thing is, a fighter like this, unless he develops that part of his game, and listen, Jake can be forgiven for not having developed part of his game. He's literally only got 12 total fights or 13 total fights, but he still is having trouble holding his ground and countering from where he is. There's with the defensive aspect of boxing, there's blocking, there's range changing, and sometimes there's holding your position and slipping and punching back. So, Jake always just jumps back. He got his gloves up at times, but he still gets hit even when his gloves up. You saw when Chavez did throw punches, some of the shots got through. So you got to overcome. It's very novice-y to just jump out of range each and every time offense comes your way. You eventually got to overcome that and pick just some moments, not all the time, but just some moments where you're holding your ground when your opponent throws at you so that you can counter right from where he's at. And that allows you to take control of the ring at times. Jake had control of the ring because Chavez wasn't throwing any punches. But ultimately, if you have a guy who's actually qualified, which, I got to be honest, Jake hasn't fought anybody who's qualified, unless these things really are rigged. Jake hasn't fought anybody qualified because they haven't even shown this very generic element that is a key weakness in any boxer's game. You can't always jump out of range anytime punches are thrown at you. That cannot be your defense because you will never achieve even a mediocre level there. And call him a prospect like they were trying to sell us all you want. Ariel Helwani shamelessly was making like Jake was carrying Mike Tyson in the fight. I thought that was absolutely disgraceful and shameless shameful that he said that, because you got to actually have experience and ring generalship prowess in order to know how to carry a guy. And Chavez Jr. may have that ring experience and ring generalship to carry a guy by knowing how to put himself in position and not throwing punches. But Jake does not. Jake doesn't have that experience. So Jake was not carrying Mike Tyson. I thought the fact that Ariel Helwani has been reporting all these years and still can't figure out what it looks like to carry a guy, what it looks like to not carry a guy is actually shameful in itself too. But I'll say this to finish this whole thought, guys. This to me looked like they ever seen the movie Raging Bull? We've all seen it, right? We know what I'm talking about. This looked like the commissioner going up to Chavez and be like, are you going to throw the fight?
There's word that you're going to throw the fight.
There's rumors you're going to throw the fight. And Chavez's father saying, my son had the best camp of his life. He's been working so hard, this and that. Don't worry, bet everything you got. And then he comes out and throws no punches. I'm just saying, dude. It was really, really weird to watch this thing tonight. Not to mention, I almost fell asleep. I had to slap myself a few times because it's 1:15 in the morning on the East Coast, and where I'm trying to go to sleep, and I got to stay up because I got to do this freaking show after that ridiculous main event.
Well, I actually took 2 naps because listen, this card was actually really good, but the layout of the card was really bad. There was a lot of really long gaps where they were interviewing a lot of people. I watched more Oscar De La Hoya speaking tonight than on Clapback Thursday.
Yeah,
he was on camera the whole time. Which, listen, I love Oscar.
For Canelo, but they told him not to do it. You see, he almost did the Canelo.
I love Oscar. He's the gift that keeps giving, but I want to watch boxing, man. And the card was so good. There was so many good fights on the card. But yeah, I took a couple naps in there. I actually missed the Holly Holm fight, and then tuned in right as Tevin Farmer got knocked out. But good. It was a good card, but the run of show was tough because it was very drawn out, very long, and then obviously the main event, which was probably the fight that we're least excited about because the card was really good. We spoke about it on our show. It was really good from bottom to top, and at the top, actually, it was even more underwhelming than I expected. The main event.
Let's talk about those two things. There was a UFC on tonight, and the UFC main card generally starts at 10 p.m. They finished about the same time, so 2 hours, and you got the same number of fights. The cards were just paced a lot faster. That's a criticism a lot of combat sports people, and Chris, you're from kickboxing, not from MMA, this idea that people aren't boxing fans. When they tune in a boxing fan, that's their number one gripe is, man, there's a lot of filler. It's not paced well.
Not on ProBox TV.
Right.
ProBox TV, we keep our
sure. For sure. We had to with an ambulance problem, something like that. But big pay-per-views tend to have a lot of fluff, and people who are fans of other combat sports tend to come to see a big boxing event like this, and the pacing does drive a lot of people nuts. Also, to your point, Chris, Floyd Schofield looking fantastic. Kevin Farmer knocking him out in round number 1. That was an incredible fight. Ramirez over
Dorticos. Good fight. It was a good fight.
Fantastic fight. That was really, really entertaining. Griffin getting knocked out by Julian Rodriguez in the final round. This was a great card. set. It was a great card. But to your point, there would be long breaks. It would kind of throw everything off, and then we would.
I actually was watching this card and thinking like, this is kind of in the vein of a ProBox TV card. You've got a lot of 50-50 matchups. You've got guys who are signed to the promotion who are losing. I mean, Julian Rodriguez was not signed to MVP. The other guy was Griffin. And Griffin, I met Griffin in New York City on the undercard of Chavez, and when he won the title. And I talked to him, who's with the camp, and they told me his record. I'm like, oh man! And then they told me he was going to fight. I forgot who he was going to fight. He's going to fight somebody really, really tough, like the next week, and he knocked him out in like one round. And I was like, wow, this guy's feels so really washed. And Julian Rodriguez is a guy who grew up in our area. Paulie, I think he's a Jersey, and very underwhelming in terms of when he stepped up. And so he was brought in as an opponent, but a live opponent, and he could always punch. His nickname was Hammer Hands. He was a big top-ranked signee, and that didn't work out for him. But listen, he got this opportunity, goes out there, scores a knockout against their undefeated power-punching guy. It was not the most entertaining fight to say, but it was cool to see the underdog knock off the prospect. Yeah. So a very, very ProBox TV-esque. The Kevin Farmer Schofield fight was a massive surprise.
Even that one was a shock because of the way the ended. First round, he had a favorite one.
But that was like a 50-50 fight, though. Like, in terms of matchups, that was like, I don't know who's going to win this fight. Schofield going down there and blowing him out in one round was not on anyone's bingo card. Couldn't miss. No. He landed every power punch he threw. He dropped him in the first 30 seconds of the round. The fight was over before 2 minutes were done. And Tevin Farmer, who not only has been durable, but has been super slick his whole career. And his last 3 fights went the distance with Zepeda twice, majority decision, split decision losses, very, very close fights, especially the first one. And then Motataya, who's a world champion right now. Schofield goes out there and blows him out in one round. Massive, massive statement. That kid, listen, I had questions about where he was in terms of his career, what's going to happen with him next. Now I'm like, I got to see more. That kid can really fight.
And Curiel knocking out Rodriguez. I haven't discussed that.
I like that kid Curiel. He really has that in factor for the Mexican fans. We overplay that sometimes with Mexican and Puerto Rican fighters. Oh, he's Mexican, he's Puerto Rican. You gotta have a combination of a lot of things, and I think that kid Curiel has that. He has that, that personality, that zest to his not only his boxing style but also his presence when he's speaking. He speaks well also, on top of having that fiery personality, and he's an entertaining fighter. I think they got something with that kid. And the welterweight division is also super weak. So that kid can really, I think, can really light up something in the welterweight division and be fun, and that's where you can give the Mexican fans credit, because you get behind a guy like this. I think you can really build that kid up into something, especially in an open welterweight division.
What I am curious about before we all, take our much deserved rest here, one of the things I'm very, as a fan, right? You guys are boxing professionals. You were world champions. I'm coming from a fan's perspective. Yes, I fought, but I'm an educated fan. And one of the things that bothers me is the wait till I get started. And you go, aren't you started? You're 28 years old. This whole prospect thing is kind of, all right, but you're the main event on pay-per-views people are buying. You can't have it both ways. Prospects are 20 years old and they were in the Olympics. You are 28 years old and you're headlining pay-per-views. So this idea of he's about to do something or about to get something started, all right, either fight a world-class guy who's actually in your weight class or stop. It's just, when are we going to actually see that, Chris? What's your thought on that timetable?
The thing about Jake is he doesn't have to do anything. He can do it. So there was a really poignant interview with his brother, Logan, earlier in the night, and they asked him, "Oh, does he have to stop him?" And he goes, "No, Jake doesn't have to do anything." He doesn't. I mean, he is the boss. He is the guy cutting the checks. He is everything. He's carefully cultivated his career the way that he has. fought a bunch of no-hopers early on. But then you pick no-hopers who look like they're hopers. You know, you pick the Chavez Jr. It's like, that guy's got 60 pro fights. He's a son of a legend. He's a former world champion. Yeah, that's what you do. That's what you do. Like, so I'm not knocking him at all in terms of that. And in terms of him being able to make money doing it, I mean, the guy has a social media arm that's very strong. He has a production company that's able to put these on. He has a promotional company that's doing really, really good for a lot of other fighters as well. So I don't know. The card was good. The runner show, not great. Main event, not great. But the card was good, and we got to see a lot of really good fighters fight tonight. And in terms of what you were saying, Jimmy, this is why I keep saying these cards are bottom to top. Because the top of the card is Jake, and he's probably the least talented, skilled, experienced guy on the card. But he's giving a lot of opportunity for these other people, these other fighters who deserve it. And a lot of people are making money, and he's making money too. So, I mean, can I knock him for that? No. His business savvy's fantastic. And his boxing needs a lot of work.
So who took the night for you, Paulie? Was it Schofield in his knockout? That was impressive stuff in round number one.
Yeah, Schofield in his knockout. I like Curio. I really enjoy Curio. I think Zurdo confirmed to me that he's going to get his ass whooped by Opatayas, but he won the fight. But for sure he's going to get his ass whooped.
But does he beat Jake? But does he beat Jake?
Yeah.
Because that's what this is really about.
I doubt they'll make Jake and Zurdo. But I'll say that that I think that, you know, that long and short of it, I confirm everything the champ Chris said, but I'm gonna just judge Jake on his boxing, and I think promotionally he's got a great company, and I love the fact that a lot of people get opportunities, and we actually had an entertaining undercard. If you eliminate the main event, there's actually nothing to complain about with this card. Yeah, okay, run of show, all that other stuff, but the fights were good. That's what ultimately really boxing fans we're pretty simple people. We just want good fights. Really good show, with the exception of the main event. But when it comes to Jake as a prospect, I gave my points as far as the kind of weaknesses he has to his boxing, the kind of strengths he has to his boxing. There is no real prospect that fights your turn, my turn, until Jake knows how to, you know, hold his ground in spots and mix his defense and transition to offense from defense, and not just go only defense or only offense, only defense, only offense. He is not actually a prospect, no matter how they want to sell it, you know. But I don't know if that takes a bit more, both mentally and physically, in order to know how to hold your ground. Because you got to pick the spots to hold your ground. Because there's spots you hold your ground, and there's spots you don't hold your ground, and you got to be the decision maker in terms of knowing how to do that. So that's where boxing gets a little bit complicated when you're doing it. And Jake is missing that entire part of his game. So for me, no real prospect is missing that part of their game. He's a prospect, but he's not a prospect to watch. He's a popular guy, and he's going to keep continuing to put these shows on. And I look forward to the undercards. As far as his main events, yeah, he can do whatever he wants, like we just said. But I don't think he's going to progress boxing wise that much unless he adds that part to his game.
Yeah, it's true. The next move Jake Paul makes, you know it'll be big, but we, the hardcores, will enjoy the undercard for sure. But you want a card that you're going to love. That's right. July 12th, Fresno, California. Save Mart Center, Lester Martinez versus Pierre Diombe. That's right. It's going to be outstanding. A great fight at 168 pounds. Join us there July 12th. Everybody get some sleep tonight for the champs. Chris Algieri, Paulie Malignaggi. I'm Jimmy Smith. Thank you so much for joining us here on ProBox TV. We'll see you next time.
Night, guys.